Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda bersama saya Iza Izlan dan pada hari ini kita ada satu temu bual eksklusif bersama dengan tim grocer iaitu Menteri Perdagangan dan antara lain dalam portfolio ini juga ada terlibat dengan climate change dan juga negotiations. Dan saya akan terus bersama dengan tim grocer dan temu bual ini akan dalam bahasa Inggeris. Unless you want to take this interview in
saya bisa bicara bahasa Indonesia tapi bukan bahasa Melayu.
So, tidak dalam bahasa...
menghindari kesalahpahaman, lebih baik kalau meneruskan dalam bahasa Inggeris, saya pikir.
Yeah, you might be better than my bahasa Malaysia, right? So, let's not. Okay, so let's talk about, firstly, why you're here in Kuala Lumpur. It's the 40th anniversary of the ASEAN-New Zealand dialogue. Maybe you want to share a little bit about what have been in discussion whilst you were here.
Well, the formal reason that I'm here is to participate in this mother of all negotiations that is known by this acronym of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, but really is the consequence of ASEAN having solidified its own integration and moving out to then some of its key regional trading partners. And the first phase of that was, of course, to try and establish FTAs, or free trade area agreements, with some of the most important trading partners of ASEAN, and 6 of them have been done. Some giants like China, India, and down to New Zealand, Australia, and now we're trying to pull it all together into a single integrated zone of economic and investment integration. So this is a major undertaking with many complexities when you think about the differences in levels of development, culture, and size. But we're moving forward, I think, in a very propitious way. Malaysian preparations for this meeting have been outstanding, and Mustafa Mohamad, whom I know, Menteri Perdagangan, I know extremely well. He's done an excellent job of getting us to the point where we have reached agreement on something that I guess the public out there would be, well, I could destroy your ratings in a single step if I were to start to explain what modalities means. But we've agreed on some means to try and advance this. And I think we're responding under difficult circumstances to what our leaders, including your own Prime Minister, have asked us to do. So that's the big picture. But I mean, if I step back from my immediate purpose in being here, I've been involved with ASEAN professionally for, well, 40 years. And I mean, what I see is just absolutely enormous progress in most of the ASEAN countries. Obviously, there's still 4 least developed economies, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, who've got an enormous amount of ground to cover. But when you think that in 1970, the per capita income of this great country was well under $1,000 per head per year, and is now, what, about 12,000 in the course of one professional lifetime. I mean, that is astonishing progress. So what we see, I mean, you can see it if you just look out the window of this beautiful hotel, you can see it. That skyline would have been unimaginable 40 years ago. And whatever arguments go on in each of our countries politically about what government should not be doing, if you step back and look at it, you cannot be but impressed at the enormous political, social, and economic progress that's been made in ASEAN countries. And I often say that when I first became involved with ASEAN, we used to look at our relations with the ASEAN countries primarily through the prism of threat. So we had been involved in the insurgency movement against the government of the Federation of Malaya, as it then was, during the communist insurgency. This region had just escaped from confrontasi. There was poverty everywhere. Inflation in 1967 in Indonesia was hyperinflation, with 70% of their people below $1 a day. And when we, and I guess Australia, similarly looked to Southeast Asia, it was not as a source of opportunity, but a source of instability, poverty. 40 years on, we have a totally different view of ASEAN. What we see is a place that has still got some developmental challenges, particularly in the 4 least developed ASEAN economies, but has made astonishing progress, is now the 3rd largest entity in terms of population in the world, 7th largest in terms of GDP, with only one way, and that's up. and a major trading partner for us. So it's a very different picture that I see now over a 40-year perspective.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the implementation of the plan of action, I was reading for the joint declaration for ASEAN and New Zealand comprehensive partnership, there were like 4 flagship initiatives that you wanted to focus on, which are education, disaster management, young business leadership, and also agriculture, diplomacy. And I would like to talk more about young business leadership, and what are some of the things that you've implemented back there in New Zealand?
This is a relatively new, I mean, what we're trying to do is 4.5 million people, small country. I mean, we're a well-off country and we have very sophisticated technologies, but not across the suite of needs of ASEAN countries as a whole. So we focus on what we do best, and the 4 things that you've mentioned are things that New Zealand is, we think, world-class in. Mm-hmm. The Young Business Leaders Initiative is a very interesting initiative. It started out as an idea from a think tank that actually, on a personal basis, I used to head 15 years ago myself. Mm-hmm. And it is looking to the next generation, not orang tua seperti saya, okay, looking to the next generation of innovative young thinkers in Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and then bringing them together with similar smart young people in New Zealand. Mm-hmm. I think we've had, in the 2 or 3 years it's been going, something like 45 of these. I mean, they're not students. These are, I guess, people in their early 30s, sort of.
Early 30s? Okay.
More or less.
Okay.
So they've got some experience and they've done real stuff with their lives already. And, you know, I think it's a great idea to establish business links, because, you know, you can have so many formal government people meeting each other, and we all know each other very well, the foreign ministry and the trade ministry people, but actually we need to now go a little beyond government to government.
Yeah, and also I think there is an untapped potential, but, you know, small, medium businesses, but you've got about 350,000 SMEs currently, and are you looking at growing this number? And if so, do you think it is sustainable?
Well, the reality is that around the world, even including the United States, the vast majority of companies are small and medium-sized enterprises. It's not specific either to New Zealand or to developing countries. The reality is that most companies have got 20 or so less employees. Mm-hmm. You'd have a very different picture if you look at the contribution of SMEs in terms of total employment, because you'll see some giant companies produce a very large percentage of employment. The trick for us, whether Malaysians or New Zealanders now, is to leverage those companies and scale them up where they can succeed and be internationally competitive. Mm. So I don't think it's nothing specific to the size of a country. It's just that is the reality. If you're a smart young Malaysian, you don't start off by founding a conglomerate of 1,000 employees. Yeah. You start with yourself and grow.
So I was reading stuff.com, a news portal online, and I saw your name on the headline. You said that the NZ-TPPA opposition is completely extreme, and that you acknowledge that the government can't quite win the battle to sign the TPPA while the controversial deal remains secret. So why is that?
Well, the way I explain it to New Zealanders is that if you think about it, nothing in life that requires change and adjustment of expectations to new circumstances and new ideas can be done without discretion. Every single cabinet in my country for the last 150 years has had strict confidentiality around its internal procedures to allow the different ministers internally to argue. Maybe they share 90% of the same ideas and probably 100% of the same objectives. But you put, you know, 4 or 5 Malaysians or 4 or 5 New Zealanders in a room, you'll have different views on the best way to proceed. You cannot do that while you're still trying to come to a consensus in the full glare of publicity. So necessarily, negotiations which involve highly sensitive matters are done in confidence. But we're all democracies. we have to be accountable to our people at the end. So the idea is just like an internal political process. Confidentiality while you're working through the compromises that are required. Then you, the representative of democratic Malaysian government or New Zealand government, you have to be ready to confront your people, your media and your stakeholders with what you've done. So it is a bit difficult for the governments to fully defend themselves because we are bound by an agreement on confidentiality during the process. At the end of it, everything is out there on the table. Now, this allows, I mean, I don't want to pretend that all the people who are opposed to TPP in any of our countries have got completely no basis for their concerns, but often they are wildly exaggerated, and I have to say, often they are deliberately exaggerated by certain people who want to stop trade agreements, sometimes for ideological reasons, sometimes for vested interest reasons. So it's very difficult for the governments to fully defend their position during the negotiation process. But I'm confident that this is going to be a good deal for New Zealand. I'm sure that your government will reach a similar conclusion. Otherwise, they won't join. And then they will defend their position and will be able to counter some of these literally extreme concerns. I mean, some of the examples I could give you is I received a claim the other day that this will mean under TPP demonstrations will now be illegal. I mean, I'm sorry. Could you imagine a democratically elected government agreeing to a trade negotiation that would turn your country into a dictatorship? I mean, it is so extreme as to be laughable, but out there in our communities, people have got these wild ideas. We'll correct them later.
I think the sentiment somehow is similar here in Malaysia, amongst Malaysians as well as New Zealanders. Maybe we can try and understand the fear behind this TPP. Why do you think there's such a backlash? Do you think they don't understand the nature of this, or maybe because if like in Malaysia, then we have a lot of families with family businesses and small businesses, and they fear that with this agreement, their businesses will fail? Well,
I would say, from my understanding of Malaysian economy, that concern is again wildly exaggerated. Malaysia really has been a pretty open economy over the past 20 or 30 years. A great deal of opening up was done under Dr. Mahathir, and Malaysia is basically a competitive economy. The idea that Malaysia could have achieved what it's achieved by being a closed economy is laughable. So I would say to Malaysian friends, have confidence in what you've already proven, which is you've entered into an integration effort with ASEAN, competing against 250 million Indonesians. You've got free trade areas with the whole of Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. This is simply a logical extension of the same process. Has this brought dislocation and difficulty to Malaysia? No, on the contrary. Trade benefits everybody. Trade is the engine of Malaysian growth. The trade to GDP ratio of Malaysia is astonishingly high by international standards. This country would never be at the level of development if it had followed protectionist policies. So while I understand the concerns, I'd say look back into your own past and have confidence.
And can you gain the same faith in New Zealanders?
Absolutely, and this is exactly the same argument. Look, we in 1980 were the most protected developed country in the world for a set of reasons that I won't bore you with. And then we started slowly a process of liberalisation, first only with Australia, and then after we got the confidence that we were not going to die from trade liberalisation, and actually it was a lot easier than we had imagined, we then liberalised with the rest of the world. So I put exactly the same case. What you can't see is the opportunities that what we can never point to are the Malaysian companies that right now as we speak do not even exist today. But when you open up a trade agreement and open up new opportunities, you give some smart person in KL or wherever the opportunity to start to create something new. That's something governments can't measure when they enter into these agreements. You've got to have, fundamentally, you've got to make a decision. Are you going to be North Korea or South Korea, is a simple way of putting it. I mean, if protectionism were the answer, how come the per capita income of South Korea is whatever it is, 100 times? I don't know what it is, but a vast multiple of North Korea. You've got a completely closed economy and a completely open economy of people who are basically the same but have made fundamentally different political choices.
That's a good case study. All right, let's talk now about New Zealand as a brand. I mean, you travel a lot, and I'm sure if like people know that you're from New Zealand and stuff, they would actually mention a few things like, I don't know, Kiwi, All Blacks, Hobbiton, Lord of the Rings. So how have you seen New Zealand, kind of create its own branding to the world with such, strong symbols?
Well, look, I think New Zealand has a great brand. And by the way, I have also really admired the Malaysia Truly Asia brand. I think that's been another highly successful branding exercise on a countrywide basis. I think we too have got a fantastic brand. We are a very successful country. We have our own problems and challenges, but we are a very successful country, and I think we've got a number of elements we've tried to integrate into our brand. First of all, yes, the clean and green. That doesn't mean we don't have any environmental issues we need to look after. We do. Secondly, we have this enormous strength in agribusiness. I mean, when you look at agribusiness, while New Zealand is a small country by population, I like to say only half as a joke that we are a little tiny superpower in world agriculture. So, world's largest dairy exporter, world's largest sheep meat exporter, very significant exporter of high quality horticultural products as well. But we're also, I think, a very innovative country. And what we've tried to do is create a brand, quite recently actually, put a lot of work into this, as both in terms of private sector and government, into a brand that says open hearts, meaning we're welcoming people. We want to see Malaysians. We get over 30,000 Malaysians a year come to our country as tourists, and we get about 2,000 students, overwhelmingly university students. Open spaces, meaning you've got this beautiful country, physically large country, about the size of the United Kingdom in terms of geographical size, and open minds, meaning we're ready to take up new technologies and to think in an innovative way. So I feel quite confident about my country's future. We've done a very strong adjustment from a highly protected to an open economy. It had its transitional problems in the 1990s, but it's going very, very well.
And speaking of agro-businesses, you were recently described as the most powerful man in the world of agriculture, where you were responsible for, brokering the final groundbreaking deal in Marathon for, I think, about a 13-hour session, right? So do you want to tell me?
Frankly, that was 10 years ago, before I decided to, as I like to call it, join the dark side and go into politics. But that was a long time ago, when the multilateral trade negotiations, known as the Doha Development Round taking place in the WTO, had real momentum. And yes, although it's a little, exaggerated, the claim, but yes, it was a global event of significance. But unfortunately, and I say this with enormous regret, the momentum has been lost completely in Geneva and in the multilateral trading system, which means it is even more than ever important that countries like Malaysia and New Zealand, who survive on trade, are part of these new large regional deals like TPP, like the ASEAN negotiations that Malaysia has been hosting here, because we can't, if we can't move forward with the world completely, and it appears unfortunately that to be the case, then let's go forward in the Asia Pacific, where we have the world's most dynamic economies, and we have enormous opportunities, and let's do it in a politically sensitive way. So I don't think there's tremendous adjustments for very open economies like Malaysia and New Zealand, but some of the countries that are participating do have highly protected sectors that will require long periods of adjustment. But that's the choice.
Although you are now serving in the Ministry of Trade, but I'm pretty sure agriculture and also climate change is also still part of your passion.
Yes, I'm very, very committed to the climate change negotiations, and I think I might be the only Minister of Climate Change who's also the Minister of Trade. There's a set of reasons for that, but the climate change negotiations are, well, they're in some ways even more difficult than trade, because our people, they can see visual pollution, you know, in their rivers and in their mountains, but they can't see the slow build-up of emissions in the atmosphere. And asking people to accept putting a price on carbon and to start making adjustments to clean technologies is quite a difficult program. I feel, but I can't prove my point, there's been an important but unmeasurable shift in attitudes over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah.
The people who deny this, I think, are beginning to sound out of touch. So I think the political base for us now as a world community to move forward is there. But what makes it horrendously difficult is that we've got to have a collective effort. You know, if New Zealand or Malaysia decided tomorrow to become completely carbon neutral, come what may, doesn't matter what the economic cost of doing that was, we're just going to no longer have any growth of emissions. It would actually achieve nothing, because you can't protect the generation or 2 generations of Malaysians from now from the effects of climate change by what Malaysia does. Only in the context of a collective action can we protect the next generations of Malaysians and New Zealanders from the insidious effects of this. At the same time, we have to allow space for developing countries to develop, and that means with existing technologies that their emissions will go up. But what we're trying to achieve is what we call a point out there, maybe around between 2020 and 2030, where emissions globally will peak and start to decline. And here I'm slowly becoming more optimistic. The agreement reached between President Obama and President Xi at the last APEC leaders meeting in Beijing, which sets out a basis for the two largest emitters in the world. Together they're responsible for, from memory, 36% of global emissions. So without China and US doing something, we're just wasting our time. China has now taken, I think, decisive steps, not just for climate change reasons, because anything you do in the nature of energy efficiency has a double payoff in terms of emissions. But I think China is now set on a course where they will peak their emissions probably earlier than 2030, which is what they've accepted politically. And I think other major developing country emitters will need to respond to that, but not at the cost of their development. You know, I may remember Dr. Mahathir very strong on this issue when the more extreme environmental European groups were attacking Southeast Asian countries on environment, being absolutely firm in his defense of the right of people in this country and Indonesia and other countries to exploit their opportunities and have decent housing, decent education, decent health services. That to me is a given. Any program on any of these environmental challenges that tries to suppress the development process will fail. So the art in this is to have a win-win solution, and I slowly, as I said, becoming a little more optimistic that we're starting to identify technologies and political acceptance that will allow us to achieve both objectives.
Which is the bigger challenge, though? Is it the awareness of people, or do you think the execution of it?
I think the execution of it is now the biggest challenge, because while I said I can't prove my point, I think awareness is now more generally there in our communities. But again, we have now got to develop clean technologies that do not force people to make a choice between their standard of living and the environment.
Okay. And just sidetrack a little bit, we want to talk about women in the workforce, and I don't know how it is in New Zealand, but I'm guessing that more and more women are joining the workforce. And in fact, your former Prime Minister was a female. You've been under the leadership of Helen Clark for about a decade. So how was that? Like, do you make conscious efforts to make female more apparent in the workforce?
Oh, absolutely. So New Zealand's got a pretty good record on this. We're the first country in the world to give women the vote back in whenever it was. Forget now, 1916 or so. I forget when it was, but a long time ago. And so we were right at the edge of the women's suffrage movement. And yes, we've had a couple of prime ministers who have been women. We got, from memory, 7 out of our 20 ministers are women in our current cabinet, and a fair proportion of our members of parliament would be women. There's still clear statistical evidence, though, that women in senior business positions are considerably underrepresented in New Zealand. So, you know, we've just got to push ahead with this agenda. I think social acceptance is generally there. I'm not sure that the phrase glass ceiling any longer has the same force it had 25, 30 years ago. But it's particularly in the senior business sector that I would say we've got a lot of work to do yet.
All right, thank you so much, Tim Grosser, Minister of Trade of New Zealand. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Sama-sama.
Sama-sama.